Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're going into the details of a case that's, well, it's been heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. We're talking about the murder investigation of 19-year-old Sade Robinson and the trial of Maxwell Anderson, which is actually happening right now.
Yeah, and you've shared quite a bit of source material with us on this. We're looking at everything from, digital footprints, surveillance video, all the way to forensic reports and the legal arguments being made in court as we speak.
Right. So our mission here is to try and unpack all that complexity. We want to look closely at the information that's being presented in these sources and really help you get a clearer picture of the evidence and how the legal system is attempting to piece it all together.
It's definitely a difficult subject, no question. But let's dive in and see what the material tells us.
Okay. Where do we start?
Well, tragically, it starts with Sade Robinson. The sources describe her as, a young woman, just 19. She was really close to finishing her associate's degree in criminal justice at MATC.
And the picture painted by friends and family, she sounds like someone who was careful, cautious.
Exactly. They mentioned she regularly shared her location using that Life 360 app.
For safety.
For safety, yeah. And that habit, it becomes just incredibly significant as this case unfolds.
It really does. That app, that Life 360 data, it's like a digital thread that investigators could actually follow. So the sources tell us, on the evening of April 1st this year, 2024, Sade had plans. She was meeting Maxwell Anderson.
And we know from text messages and also surveillance footage that they went to a restaurant first. Twisted Fisherman, apparently a place Anderson used to work.
Okay.
And then from there, the trail leads downtown to Duke's on Water, and finally, using her phone data, investigators tracked her movements to Anderson's place, his residence on the south side of Milwaukee.
Right, and this is where the timeline gets really tight, really critical. Sade Robinson's phone. It was last tracked at Anderson's home until around 12:45 in the morning, the early hours of April 2nd.
And that's it. That's the last time anyone she knew had contact or any confirmation of where she was.
Just hours later, hours after her phone stops pinging at Anderson's place.
Right.
Her car, a 2020 Honda Civic, is found. It's near 30th and Lisbon, morning of April 2nd, and it's completely burned out.
Yeah, investigators were there fast. You had ATF, the state crime lab, and they figured out pretty quickly it was arson. Deliberately set, they found evidence of a petroleum-based accelerant, poured inside the car in the passenger area.
And this is just, it's chilling.
Yeah.
Inside the trunk of that burned car, they found burned clothing, clothing that matched what Sade was last seen wearing.
So the speed of it all.
Yeah.
Her last known location is Anderson's apartment. Then almost immediately her car is found burned miles away with her clothes inside. It really suggests, it points towards a very rapid, deliberate effort to destroy evidence, to conceal whatever happened.
Speaks to intent right from the start.
Absolutely.
And that detail about her sharing her location, her being cautious, that Life 360 data turns into this vital breadcrumb trail for the investigation.
It's a stark example, isn't it? How our digital lives, things we use for safety or just connection, can become absolutely critical pieces of evidence in cases like this.
Definitely. Okay, let's brace ourselves. The next part is, it's tough. It's the timeline of how Sade's remains were found. So, April 2nd, after that 12:45 a.m. point, her phone signal actually moved across Milwaukee. It eventually became stationary over in Cudahy at Warnermont Park and stayed there until about 4:30 in the morning.
And there's surveillance video from the park, apparently. It reportedly showed her car there and someone moving down towards the bluff.
Later that same day, April 2nd, a person walking there, Osiris Terrell, found something horrific near a shoreline trail, a severed human leg.
Just awful. And preliminary DNA testing came back quickly, confirming it was Sade Robinson's. The reports mention investigators noting it looked like it had been sawn off.
Just unimaginable. Okay, so days pass. April 4th, Maxwell Anderson is arrested. It was a traffic stop pretty close to his home.
Then the next day, April 5th, investigators are searching a wooded area, a park near 31st and Galena, which is, interestingly, quite near where Sade's car was found burned.
Right. And in that search,
they found 3 more pieces of human remains. Some flesh, a piece of bone with flesh still attached, and a foot.
And the description of the cuts.
On those remains near 31st and Galena, the sources say the cuts appeared clean. And a really crucial moment here, actually, was when Sade's own family found her blanket in that same park area.
Wow.
Yeah. That discovery prompted police to really ramp up their search efforts there, and that's when they found another leg. This one was described, I think the quote was, more cleanly cut at the ankle, and it looked like someone had tried to deliberately cover it up.
And the discoveries just kept coming, even weeks later.
They did. April 18th, another civilian, Angela Sawyer, found a torso and an arm washed up on a beach in South Milwaukee, confirmed as Sade's.
The description from the court testimony was just grim. Partially buried in sand, the right breast severed, one arm still attached.
But her tattoos were visible. That was key for identification.
And then even into May 11th.
Sade's right arm was found, washed ashore way down in Waukegan, Illinois. DNA confirmed it. There was another report of a suspected arm found there later, too.
And it's important to say, based on the sources, that as of the trial starting, Sade's head has still not been found.
Still missing, yes.
So when you look at this pattern, body parts scattered across Milwaukee County, Cudahy, South Milwaukee, even reaching into Illinois, what does that tell you? What does that geographic spread suggest?
Well, the sheer range, the dispersal, it strongly implies, a very calculated, extensive effort, not just dismemberment, but scattering the remains widely. The goal seems to be hindering identification, making recovery as difficult as possible. It's not like someone panicking and hiding a body in one spot.
It feels methodical.
Exactly. Yeah. Methodical, deliberate concealment, evasion. And those descriptions of the cuts, sawn off, clean cuts, they also suggest potentially the use of specific tools, a certain level of purposefulness in the dismemberment itself.
The sources did mention how tough those searches were for investigators, too. The areas were littered with trash, other debris.
Which makes finding anything incredibly challenging, and that's something the defense has definitely picked up on. They've pointed out these are public areas, accessible between police searches, suggesting, maybe tampering could have occurred, or maybe someone else was involved in the disposal.
Okay, let's talk about the accused, Maxwell Anderson. He's 34 now, at the time of trial. The sources mentioned some past legal troubles, going back to when he was a teenager.
Yeah, things like underage drinking, fleeing from police, some property damage, obstructing an officer. His work history seems to be mainly bartending, some security work.
He was arrested April 4th, held on a really high bond, $5 million.
Yeah.
And then formally charged on April 12th. Could you just remind us of those specific charges?
Sure. 4 felony counts: first-degree intentional homicide, mutilating a corpse, hiding a corpse, and arson of property other than a building for the car.
And he pleaded not guilty to everything.
Not guilty to all charges, correct.
His trial started pretty recently, May 28th, 2025. Expected to last about 2 weeks, so it's ongoing as we discuss this. Okay, let's shift gears. Let's look at the prosecution's case. How are they trying to prove this?
Well, their strategy really leans heavily on circumstantial evidence. They're weaving together this complex web of details. They don't have, say, an eyewitness to the killing itself or that direct smoking gun for the homicide charge. So they're building a case based on the aftermath.
And a huge part of that web is digital, right? We talked about the Life 360 tracking her to his home.
Exactly. And cell phone records also track her phone, leaving his address after 12:45 a.m. on April 2nd, and moving towards Warnemont Park, where the first remains were found.
And surveillance video. That plays a big role, too.
A critical role. There's video reportedly showing Sade's car before the fire. And then, crucially, footage that the prosecution says shows Anderson walking away from the burning car. He's then seen getting on a bus that heads back towards his neighborhood.
There's other footage, too, showing her car near where remains were found, and activity at his house.
Yes, footage placing her car near discovery sites, and video from near Anderson's house showing sort of on and off movement around the time she disappeared. Lights, activity, that kind of thing.
And there was something really disturbing mentioned in the sources found on Anderson's phone. Photos.
Yeah. This is particularly difficult. Reports say investigators found images on his phone. One allegedly shows Sade Robinson lying face down on his couch. Another seems to show her pants and underwear being removed.
And those items, her pants, her underwear, those are the same things found burned in the trunk of her car.
Exactly. That creates a direct link, from images allegedly on his phone to specific tangible evidence recovered from the arson scene. It's a powerful piece of circumstantial evidence connecting him to what happened right after she disappeared.
Okay, so moving to the forensic side, the physical evidence, we've got the arson findings, the burned clothes. There was that mention of an informal test with the car seat position, suggesting the driver later was taller than Sade, consistent with Anderson.
Right, consistent with his height versus hers. And of course, the DNA confirmation on all the recovered remains, that's central. Plus, those forensic descriptions of how the body parts were cut, that speaks to the mutilation and hiding charges.
But there was one piece of forensic evidence found at his home that's complicated. The blood.
Yes, that's a really key point, and one the defense is absolutely highlighting. Investigators found blood at Anderson's home, yes, in a bedroom near the basement stairs. But, and this is crucial, DNA testing showed it was not Sade Robinson's blood.
Not hers. Do they know whose it is?
Its origin is unknown, according to the reports. So the prosecution can't use blood from inside his home to directly link him to her injury or death there. That's a significant gap for them.
Although they did apparently find gasoline containers at his home.
They did, yeah. Which could tie into the arson charge, another piece for that circumstantial puzzle.
And then there's testimony, people taking the stand.
Right. You have the civilians who made the grim discoveries, like Osiris Terrell and Angela Sawyer. Their accounts are factual, grounding the timeline. There's the neighbor, Ashley Ryder, who testified she saw a taller white guy running from the burning car. And Sade's friends and family providing heartbreaking context about her habits, her last contacts. Her mother's testimony was reportedly very emotional.
But maybe the biggest piece of testimony for the prosecution, especially for that top charge, the intentional homicide, that came from a confidential informant.
That seems to be a major element of their case for premeditation, yes. The sources report this informant alleged something pretty shocking. They claimed Anderson had talked about planning to kill Robinson weeks before her death actually happened.
Weeks before. So, if true, that completely changes the narrative. It's not a first date gone horribly wrong. It's planned.
That's exactly the argument the prosecution is trying to make. That statement, if the jury believes it, supports the intentional part of first-degree intentional homicide. It suggests premeditation. You know, legal experts quoted in the sources sometimes say, all killers talk. It might be fantasy, compulsion, bragging. But that alleged statement is huge for the prosecution's theory.
So putting it all together, the prosecution's case is, look, we might not have his DNA on a murder weapon right at the scene of the killing, but we have this overwhelming chain of events afterwards. The digital trail, the surveillance, the photos on his phone, the car arson, the horrific disposal pattern, and this alleged prior statement. They're arguing all these threads together point inescapably to Anderson being responsible, not just for the cover-up, but for her death too.
That's the essence of it. A strong circumstantial case focused heavily on the aftermath and alleged prior intent. Now let's flip it. How is the defense pushing back? How are they trying to create that reasonable doubt?
Well, their main argument, it seems, comes down to that lack of direct forensic evidence for the killing itself.
Right. They are hammering home. There's no DNA directly linking Anderson to the act of homicide. No blood of hers in his house linking him to an attack there. No DNA on the remains suggesting he was the one who dismembered them.
It's a classic defense strategy in circumstantial cases, isn't it? Focus on what's not there.
Absolutely. They're asking the jury, is all this circumstantial evidence, however disturbing, enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that he committed the murder, especially without that direct physical link?
They also made a point about no heavy equipment or specific murder weapon being found, right?
Yeah.
Nothing recovered from his home or possession that would obviously be used for what happened?
Correct. Another point aimed at suggesting the prosecution hasn't fully proven the how, and they've really tried to cast doubt on the locations where the remains were found, especially that park near 31st and Galena.
Calling it a high-crime area.
Yeah, presenting evidence of, unrelated shell casings found nearby, animal remains, basically arguing it's a dumping ground, it's publicly accessible. The implication being maybe evidence was contaminated, maybe someone else was involved, maybe things aren't as clear-cut as the prosecution claims regarding those scenes.
And there was testimony from the tenant living below Anderson, who heard nothing.
Right. Testimony stating they didn't hear any sounds of a struggle, a fight, anything unusual from his apartment on the night Sade disappeared.
Then there was a whole issue of drugs found in Sade's apartment. What was the defense trying to do there?
They introduced evidence that marijuana and some pills, which field tested positive for meth, were found in a safe in her apartment. The apparent strategy was to try and suggest, well, maybe Sade was involved with other potentially violent people through drugs, trying to deflect suspicion away from Anderson.
But the prosecution shut that down pretty quick.
They did. They objected, stated clearly this is not a case about drugs, and crucially pointed out that toxicology reports showed Sade had no drugs in her system at the time of her death.
So the defense isn't disputing that Anderson was with her, that they went back to his place, or even that the remains found are tragically hers.
No, they seem to be conceding those points. Their argument is focused. Yes, he was with her up to his home. Yes, those are her remains. But, they maintain, he did not kill her. They're trying to create enough doubt about the homicide itself, even while acknowledging the timeline and the grim discoveries.
Which brings us to motive, the why. This is often the hardest part in cases like this.
It really is. The prosecution suggests Anderson intentionally killed her, maybe driven by that alleged prior plan mentioned by the informant. They might argue the extreme nature of the dismemberment and disposal points to a pathological desire to erase her, to conceal the crime utterly.
And the defense.
Their position is simple. Anderson had no reason to kill Robinson. They're essentially saying the prosecution hasn't provided a logical, provable motive.
And some of the reports covering the trial explicitly state that the specific why behind the killing, it still remains unknown.
That's right. And that lack of a clear, established motive is something the defense can use. It allows them to argue the prosecution's whole story might be incomplete, maybe flawed. It's also, heartbreakingly, the question Sade's family wants answered most desperately. Why did this happen?
So that's where things stand. It's this intense legal battle. Prosecution building this detailed but circumstantial case based largely on the aftermath, versus the defense zeroing in on the lack of direct proof for the killing itself, questioning the evidence, suggesting alternatives.
And ultimately, the jury has to weigh all of it. Is that web of circumstantial evidence strong enough to meet the standard of beyond a reasonable doubt? Or has the defense planted enough seeds of doubt, especially about the homicide charge?
It really highlights, doesn't it, how crucial digital forensics have become. Cell data, surveillance video. It's everything in a case like this. And also, the role of just regular people in the community. Finding that leg, that torso, those were critical moments driven by civilians.
It's a reminder that modern investigations pull evidence from so many different places now. Technology, forensics, community observation.
So as you process all this incredibly difficult information, here's a final thought maybe to consider. In a case built so heavily on what happened after someone disappeared, the disposal, the cover-up, how does a jury weigh that against the lack of, say, a direct DNA link to the initial act of violence? What does a case like this really tell us about how justice is pursued when direct evidence of the core crime is missing, especially now in our digital age?
Yeah, that's a heavy question to grapple with.